Every beginner assumes the secret to a table that lasts 100 years is the wood itself. Thick slabs, expensive walnut, a tree that grew for 2 centuries before it ever hit a sawmill. The data from generations of furniture repair tells a different story. Tables fail almost never because the wood was too thin or too cheap, and almost always because of 7 specific decisions made in the shop. Decisions that have nothing to do with the price tag on the lumber. 7 techniques separate a table that ends up in a landfill in a decade from one that gets handed down to great-grandchildren, still tight in every joint. We're counting down from the technique that matters least to the one that determines whether the whole piece survives at all. Stick around for the final technique. It's the one antique restorers rely on to save furniture that's already outlived its builder by a century. This countdown pulls from decades of forum threads on Sawmill Creek, Lumberjocks, Fine Woodworking's own community, and Woodworking Talk, cross-referenced against published wood movement data from the USDA Forest Products Laboratory and manufacturer guidance from Woodcraft. Every number that follows, shrinkage percentages, moisture content targets, acclimation windows, comes from documented sources, not shop folklore. Number 7, wood selection by cut, not just species. Most beginners walk into the lumberyard and grab whatever flat-sawn boards look prettiest, with no idea that the cut itself decides how much the tabletop will fight them for the next 100 years. The frame and panel data is blunt about this. Flat-sawn hardwood shrinks roughly 8% across its width from fiber saturation to fully dry, while quarter-sawn stock of the same species shrinks only about 4%. Quarter-sawn lumber moves only half as much as flat-sawn. Skip that distinction, and the consequence shows up years later as a tabletop that cups, or as growing gaps at every glue line every winter. A second data point backs this up. Quarter-sawn boards deliver roughly 40% to 50% less width movement compared to flat-sawn lumber, because the larger tangential shrinkage gets redirected into the board's thickness instead of its width. The trade-off is cost. Quarter-sawn material typically runs 20% to 50% more expensive per board foot than flat-sawn, since the milling process is slower and yields less usable lumber per log. For a weekend hobbyist building a coffee table for the living room, flat-sawn with good grain matching is often fine. For anyone building a wide dining table meant to survive a century of humidity swings, the premium buys real insurance against warping. But wood selection alone won't save a table if the next step gets skipped. Number 6, acclimation. The step almost every impatient beginner skips. Lumber arrives from the yard or the big box store carrying whatever moisture content it picked up in transit, and building with it immediately is one of the most common ways a table starts failing before it's even finished. Flooring installation standards, which apply the same physics as furniture, require wood to sit in the actual room it will live in for a minimum of 2 weeks before installation, matching temperature and humidity the whole time. Skip that window, and the consequence is specific. A board built into a table at 12% moisture content in a humid summer shop, then moved into a 30% relative humidity winter home, will keep shrinking after assembly, pulling joints loose and opening cracks along glue lines that looked perfect on delivery day. Regional moisture content targets published by hardwood flooring associations back this up with real numbers. Wood destined for a Florida home should sit around 12% to 13% moisture content, while the same species headed to Nevada needs only 4% to 7%, a gap wide enough to crack a tabletop if the builder doesn't check it first. Veteran woodworkers on Sawmill Creek treat a moisture meter as mandatory shop equipment for exactly this reason, since guessing at acclimation time by the calendar instead of by the actual reading is how tables fail in year 2 instead of year 50. Get the moisture content right, though, and the table still needs the right attachment hardware to survive what comes next. Number 5. Using fasteners engineered to let the top move instead of locking it down. This is the mistake that's claimed more tabletops than almost anything else on this list, and it's rarely a beginner's fault. It just looks obvious to screw a slab straight to its base. Fine Woodworking's own archive includes a builder's account of gluing and screwing his first tabletop directly to the base, parking it over a heat vent, and watching the top fail to survive its first winter. The fix is documented hardware, figure 8 fasteners, Z clips, or slotted screw holes that let the top expand and contract independently of the frame. Woodcraft's installation guidance gives the actual movement figure to plan around, roughly 3/16 inch of seasonal movement per foot of board width, which determines exactly how much clearance to leave in every fastener slot. The practical limit matters too. Figure 8 fasteners work reliably on tabletops up to about 18 inches wide because of their limited swing, but anything wider needs slotted screw holes or sliding dovetails instead, or the fastener itself becomes the point of failure. The consequence of getting this wrong isn't subtle. A rigidly fixed top doesn't crack quietly. It splits along the grain during the driest week of winter, often audibly. Get the fasteners right, and the top survives, but the base's own joinery still has to hold for a century. Number 4, breadboard ends, and specifically doing them the way that lets the top actually move. Breadboard ends are attached across the grain to keep a wide tabletop flat, and they work exactly as intended when only the center is glued while the rest of the joint is pinned through. Elongated holes that let the tenon slide. Fine Woodworking's own forum threads document the real movement figures builders plan for. A 36-inch wide red oak tabletop can expand by roughly 0.45 inches from a dry winter shop to a humid summer, and the accepted rule of thumb for sizing breadboard overhang is about 1 to 8 inch of movement for every 12 inches of width. The mistake that undoes the whole technique is gluing the breadboard end along its entire length instead of just the center. Lumberjocks' own community has repeatedly flagged this as the single most common way a breadboard-ended top splits, since a fully glued joint fights the very wood movement it was designed to accommodate, and something eventually gives, usually as a crack running straight through the panel. The practical cost of getting it wrong is a ruined tabletop mid-build, sometimes discovered a full season after assembly when the first humidity swing hits. Get the breadboard mechanics right, and the top stays flat for generations. But flatness doesn't matter if the legs and apron can't hold the load. Number 3, mortise and tenon joinery holding the base together. The joint that's outlasted every fastener trend for thousands of years for a reason. Furniture quality analysis of this joint is consistent. A properly fitted tenon distributes stress evenly across the mortise walls and creates a glue surface strong enough that, once cured, the bond frequently exceeds the strength of the surrounding wood fibers itself. Compare that to screws or dowels alone, which rely entirely on the fastener rather than a mechanical wood-to-wood interlock, and which loosen as the surrounding wood fibers compress and wear under repeated racking stress from someone leaning on a table edge for 20 years straight. The practical cost of skipping M&T in favor of pocket screws or dowels shows up as a wobbling table within 5 to 10 years of regular use, a repair job that usually means disassembling the whole base rather than tightening a single screw. Furniture industry quality control data notes that even in factory production, tolerance control is what separates a joint that lasts from one that fails prematurely. Too loose, and the glue alone can't carry the load. Too tight, and the wood itself splits under seasonal stress. For a hobbyist, building a table meant for a lifetime of use, cutting true mortise and tenon joints for the apron to leg connections, is the difference between a table that gets re-glued once a decade and one that needs its whole base rebuilt. But even a well-cut mortise and tenon benefits from one more mechanical trick that predates modern glue entirely. Number 2, draw boring. Pegging the mortise and tenon with an intentional offset so the peg itself pulls the joint tight permanently with no reliance on glue at all. The technique dates back centuries, and the surviving evidence is the strongest data point on this entire list. Furniture historians and restorers have documented an early 18th century table with a double-pinned mortise and tenon joint still holding fairly tight after roughly 300 years of seasonal stress. The mechanics explain why. The peg holes in the mortise and tenon are deliberately misaligned by a small offset. So driving a tapered peg through both pulls the tenon deeper into the mortise and keeps that tension active permanently, even as the surrounding wood shrinks over decades. Restorers who've repaired hundreds of 17th and 18th century joints report that the wider joints reinforced with 2 pegs instead of 1 have consistently held up better over time, since a single peg becomes a pivot point that lets the joint rack loose under repeated stress. The practical upside for a modern builder is real insurance against glue failure. Timber framers historically raised entire buildings on drawboard joints and wooden pegs alone. No glue or metal fasteners involved, and the technique scales down without any loss of the mechanical principle. Skip draw boring in a table depends entirely on the glue bond holding for a century. Add it, and the joint keeps tightening itself mechanically even if that bond eventually weakens. But the single decision that determines whether a table can actually survive 100 years, more than any joint or cut of wood, comes down to what's inside that joint holding it together. Number 1. And this is the technique that separates a table that merely survives a century from one that can be repaired indefinitely across that century, building with hide glue instead of PVA. Every other technique on this list buys durability. Hide glue buys something more valuable for a 100-year piece: repairability. Restoration-focused woodworkers are consistent on this point. PVA glues don't bond reliably to themselves once cured, which means a PVA-glued joint that fails after 40 years has to be scraped completely clean of old adhesive before it can be re-glued, often destroying surrounding wood fiber in the process. Hide glue behaves the opposite way. Fresh, hot hide glue chemically reconstitutes and bonds directly to old hide glue residue. So a loose joint on an 80 to 100-year-old family table, the kind restorers on Canadian woodworking forums describe handling regularly, can simply be cleaned, reheated, and reglued without disassembling the whole piece. The technical case goes further. Woodworkers on Sawmill Creek's community note that hide glue does not creep under sustained load the way PVA and yellow glues do over decades, and it has better heat resistance for pieces that sit near vents or fireplaces for a lifetime. It has no gap-filling properties, which does demand tighter, more precise joinery, but that precision is exactly what a century-scale piece needs anyway. The trade-off is real. Hide glue needs to be heated to stay workable and has a shorter open assembly time than PVA, which is genuinely harder for a first-time builder to manage, but every antique still standing in a museum after 200 years was built with it, and every restorer who repairs those pieces reaches for it first, specifically because it can be undone and redone without ever destroying the original joint. Wood selection, acclimation, fasteners, breadboard ends, and joinery all determine whether a table survives its first 50 years intact. The glue determines whether it can still be saved for the next 50 after something inevitably goes wrong. None of these 7 techniques are secrets. They're all documented, all tested by generations of woodworkers and restorers, and none of them require expensive wood or expensive tools. The real lesson isn't about any single technique on this list. It's that a table built to last a century isn't built to resist wood movement. It's built to work with it, joint by joint, from the cut of the lumber to the glue in the tenon, so that when something eventually does need repair, the piece can actually be saved instead of replaced. Which of these 7 are you already using in your own shop, and which one are you going to change on your next build? Drop it in the comments. And if you got a table in your family that's already outlived a few generations, we'd genuinely like to hear how it's held up.